Imagine this. One of the most powerful armies in the world launches an invasion that could forever change the global order. From one day to the next, not only many basic supplies, but also all the beautiful luxury goods you have grown accustomed to disappear in no time and are even no longer available or only attainable at exorbitant prices. China versus Taiwan, a conflict not just about land, but about the future of the world order. But what if I tell you that recent statements by a Chinese official reveal an even darker scenario than a conventional invasion, one that no one in the German-speaking world has paid attention to so far? A scenario that plays with deception, mass attacks, and even assassinations. Stay tuned, because in the next few minutes I will reveal facts that might shock you. If you thought the war was unlikely so far, think again after this video. Subscribe and activate the bell to not miss any future updates. Welcome to the Strategists or Newcomers. Today we dive deep into a topic that is increasingly keeping the world on edge: the potential invasion of Taiwan by the People's Republic of China. Much has already been said about it, and there will be much more to come, but recent statements by a Chinese official, which have so far been ignored, at least in the German-speaking world, cast an additional dark light on it. Kindly translated by Lai Weng's Lay's Real Talks, these statements bring new, disturbing perspectives on China's multifaceted subversion strategies and mastery of various generations of warfare, which we will explore further in the upcoming video on the 5th generation. In this video, we will cover 5 main points. First, a brief introduction to the topic, including history, geography, and military factors. Second, the latest assessments of the likelihood of an invasion by the People's Republic of China and its prospects for success in the event of an actual war. Third, a highly likely and, for this communist regime, unique scenario of the operational type of an amphibious invasion. Fourth, recent disturbing but plausible statements by a Chinese official. And fifth, possible elements of a Chinese invasion that have not yet been discussed in the German-speaking world, namely waves of robot dogs emerging from the waves. First, introduction. To greatly simplify the political and historical circumstances, in the last Chinese Civil War, the communists under Mao Zedong, i.e. the People's Republic of China, literally forced their opponents into the sea. To this day, however, these opponents claim the still existing sovereignty over all of China, called the Republic of China, on the island of Taiwan. This island lies approximately 160 kilometers off the coast of the People's Republic of China. Both warring parties now regularly emphasize their desire for reunification, but also their claim to unilateral dominance, which leads to constant tensions. Currently, Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered that mainland China's armed forces be ready by 2027 to assimilate the island nation, as a former CIA Director William Burns warns. But according to US General Mike Minihan and the Taiwanese Defense Minister, China could be capable of this as early as 2025. Regarding assessment of the likelihood of success, we will return to this in our concluding remarks and in the little discussed thought experiment called the Reverse Dunkirk. But first, we should note that China may be running out of time to capitalize on its current comparative advantages. For example, its population. Due to the one-child policy and many other cultural factors, the Middle Kingdom is currently undergoing the fastest and most severe demographic aging crisis in human history. Time is running out to utilize its youth bulge, similar to Russia's current behavior, which we can compare here, and whose past aggressions since Georgia can be explained by this. Yet if China goes to war, its economy could be choked within a year, as Peter Zion describes in his book The End of the World is Just the Beginning. In contrast, Russia has announced investments of billions of dollars in reliable oil pipelines to China, which has massive import needs in this regards. But whether these will be operational in time and reliably is questionable, as Russia has lost significant Western expertise, which gradually makes maintaining and thus the operability of much of its infrastructure difficult to impossible. Furthermore, geographical conditions and their significance on the battlefield are often decisively important. Let's recall battle formations and amphibious operational conditions.
Landing on a hostile shore is always risky. Generals who either select this battle plan, like MacArthur, or have no option but to use it, like Smith, have certain key requirements to satisfy. Objective. The commander and his subordinates must be absolutely clear why the landing is being undertaken and what their immediate aims are. Intelligence. He must know what his troops will face, not just enemy strengths and possible reinforcements, but also the terrain of the target area and local factors such as tides and beach conditions which might impact on the landings. Approach. The planners must get the troops and their equipment to the area of the landing. A sea crossing may be only a few miles or across thousands of miles of ocean. Assault. The enemy defenses must be softened up and breached, and the troops must have the right equipment to move from sea to land, often while under fire. Lodgement. The military term for securing a beachhead against counterattack and ensuring that reinforcements and supplies start flowing in swiftly.
The baseline probability of most analysis is based on China's official amphibious transport and landing capacities. Taiwan may have a considerable moat, the Taiwan Strait, but not the depth of space like, for example, Ukraine, and it cannot effectively defend itself in the long term in the event of successful bridgehead establishments, as its entire territory is within range of enemy aircraft and most missile batteries on the mainland, thus constantly threatened, with its borders practically being violated daily and maneuvers repeatedly conducted, which can desensitize and make it harder to assess the seriousness of the situation. At the same time, potential Western supply would be much more difficult, as the eastward-facing coast has very few port facilities to actually receive aid, with the necessity of crossing a massive mountain range, which would have first to break through a potential Chinese blockade. Second, latest assessments of likelihood and prospects for success. Analysts, including senior US officials, have recently warned that a war could begin in just a few years. Some argue, however, that an amphibious invasion of the island is highly complex and unlikely due to the challenges of crossing the Taiwan Strait and China's limited amphibious capabilities. But is that really the case? The Middle Kingdom's ability to transport troops across the strait could be much greater than generally assumed, and many experts increasingly recognize that China does not play by conventional rules, and in many ways does not solely rely on its armed forces for conflicts. For example, China has systematically prepared its civilian ships for potential military use against, for example, Taiwan. In 2015, technical regulations were introduced requiring shipyards to design ships not only to civilian standards, but also to explicit military needs. Ferries and other civilian ships are now designed for military purposes and are thus likely factored into a corresponding operation. The transport capacities of the Chinese Navy are estimated to be at least 5 times greater than officially stated on military paper. Nevertheless, an invasion of Taiwan would be one of the most challenging military operations in history. China would need to achieve air superiority, neutralize command centers and defenses, and prevent effective intervention by other countries like the USA or Japan. But the key to a successful classic invasion would be the ability to transport a large number of troops quickly across the Taiwan Strait and overwhelm Taiwan's defenses. This requires a significant number of amphibious landing ships. China's civilian fleet, potentially available for military purpose, far exceeds its fleet for military amphibious landing ships. Its shipbuilding capacities also have long surpassed those of the USA by a wide margin. This capacity could significantly shorten the lead time and frequency of attack waves in an invasion. Moreover, China's civilian ships can operate independently of military-controlled ports, enabling rapid mobilization and a shortened warning time for Taiwan. In exercises, Chinese ferries have demonstrated their ability to effectively load and unload troops and equipment without relying on traditional ports. Although civilian ships do not have the traditional military capabilities of warships, they could be escorted by China's rapidly growing naval fleet, both within the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Coast Guard, which also includes former military ships. These escort ships could provide protection against air and missile attacks and offer significant support to civilian ships in a conflict. Not to mention the political repercussions of bombing civilian ships if it later turns out they were only actually manned by civilians. In summary, China's civilian fleet, when used for military purposes, significantly enhances its amphibious landing capabilities, making an invasion of Taiwan appear more feasible than previously assumed. However, the actual decision to use civilian ships for military operations remains a complex and politically sensitive matter. The prospect of an invasion of Taiwan is further complicated by the limited number of suitable landing sites along its coasts. These landing sites are not only few, 7 to be exact on the western side, but also well known and well defended, making any attempt at an amphibious landing a demanding undertaking. Choosing the timing for an invasion under optimal weather conditions is critical and increases the defender's chances. This introduces further limitations, as the weather only offers favorable conditions in certain time windows of the year. In essence, the combination of limited landing sites and weather-dependent constraints adds an additional layer of difficulty to any potential invasion of Taiwan and requires many security precautions on the part of the potential aggressor, while giving the defender certain points of reference. Peter Zion in particular says, China should know better. Many analysts predict an economic collapse within a year, which, however, many also claimed about the Russian economy. A parallel to Russia's military campaigns in Chechnya and Georgia is a changing age demographic, which probably leaves both countries only a limited time window for undertaking such large military endeavors and consolidating their spheres of influence. Moreover, several Chinese anniversaries are approaching, as well as the need for a conclusion to Xi Jinping's tenure and impact. Lei Chen from Lei's Real Talks claims, by the way, that Xi is increasingly losing power and a new triumvirate leadership around former Premier Hu Jintao, Wang Xiaobao, and a military leader has begun to form and assert itself. Could this mean we might see a re-evaluation of the endeavor? Yes and no, as broader demographic factors could still make a conflict appear politically advantageous domestically. 3. The highly likely and unique scenario. This brings us to the darker fringe thought experiments of the month, inspired by Machiavelli and others. The best thought experiments and successes in war games can be achieved when you can truly get inside the opponent's head. Things are far from rosy in the Middle Kingdom, and here we want to briefly focus on the massive surplus of men compared to marriageable women. So-called youth bulges have historically always produced unrest, up to civil wars and system changes. And as Comrade Perun once put it, for regime members, regime stability often takes precedence over military practicality and logic. Not only have wars often been welcome unifying factors for consolidating fractured systems by giving them an external enemy, but reducing the manpower of its leftover younger generation could be a significant temptation to save the current systems, one's own status and life. However, in the event of failure, one would face an even more enraged group of young men who would now also be battle-hardened for the first time in decades. This leads us to our Dunkirk Uni-Reverse scenario, in which China would ideally act under maximum deception by moving military equipment to port cities and conducting troop and supply deployments more discreetly and over a longer period. Then, every single ferry and fishing trawler capable of carrying anything military, from a tank to a group of soldiers, would be loaded to the brim and set sail. Of course, the depiction of Russian wave attacks in films like Enemy at the Gates or games like Call of Duty is largely over-dramatized. However, this does not apply, or rather did not apply, to the CCP's army, which effectively overwhelmed American troops in the Korean War with more troops than the defenders could shoot fast enough. A 2023 CSIS study, The First Battle of the Next War, also plays with similar ideas. And not only here could China excel with mass, its production capacities are enormous. Most current wargames assume very favorable conditions for the availability of Western equipment, particularly for the US Navy and Air Force, during the establishment of a blockade of Taiwan, which would ensure that local resistance eventually runs out of steam. However, such a swarm attack at sea could have much darker prospects, and such an enormous effort would likely result in high losses due to accidents and congestions at choke points. But if the Chinese commissariat is feared enough, they might have a chance to make their subordinates fight like Stannis the Menace over a bridge of ships, blocking every port and potential landing site, but offering opportunities to those skilled in parkour. Especially if swarms of air, land and sea-capable drones were support to humans. Of course, the already mentioned limited number and surveillance of landing sites could make supplying landing troops very difficult if no breakout from at least one succeeds.
Breakout. Finally, the troops must move out of the beachhead and begin the next stage of the overall battle plan. It's critical to remember that assault from the sea is rarely a battle plan just in itself. It's intended to be part of a larger military campaign.
While Ukraine may have surprised every analyst with its determined resistance and endurance, and we might see similar inefficiencies in the Chinese army as in the Russian one, the Taiwanese do not have nearly as much space to trade space for time in delaying operations. Furthermore, according to our estimates, the use of such a swarm attack is a particular weak point with Western planning and wargames. Aside from the realization that they must be able to defend against drone swarms in the future, see an interview with Ukrainian Special Forces veteran Jonas Kratzenberg, already accounting for it but not yet having implemented comprehensive solutions. For example, in the past, a retired US Marine general led the nation of Iran to victory in a conflict against several US carrier groups, simply by overwhelming their defensive capabilities with improvised waterborne IEDs and massive missile attacks, which recently so crippled the Russian Black Sea Fleet that it probably no longer seems operational. Although it may seem like a far-fetched concept, it is essential to consider the potential for unexpected strategies in warfare. History has shown that innovative strategies and tactics can change the course of battles, as depicted in war games by the Center for New American Security and PBS Meet the Press. Now we come to the recent statements by a Chinese official, kindly translated by Lay's Real Talks. He explains that even a Taiwanese head of state or other leaders need to visit a doctor and possibly be put under anesthesia. If something unforeseen were to happen in this context, for example, if the doctor and the responsible official deputy could be compromised, as seen in the series Designated Survivor with Kiefer Sutherland, Taiwan's armed forces could be further hampered by massive bombardments, electronic and fifth-generation warfare, as well as likely already successful infiltrations, now also through official orders. Even the fact that Taiwan has managed to become self-sufficient in the production of many staple foods would not save it in the long term, while Western fleets are increasingly shrinking and spread thin across the world. A circumnavigation of Australia by just 2 Chinese ships, which, according to Australian officials, surpassed the combat power of the entire Australian Navy, gives an impression that China may be inferior in terms of the modernity of individual cutting-edge weapon systems, but certainly has great potential in terms of mass and ultimate outcome to achieve Napoleonic defeats in detail through consistent local superiority of forces. However, the likelihood of a successful blockade is countered, for example, by a recent wargame study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which acknowledges high US losses but remains skeptical of sustained Chinese successes. However, if one were to calculate or take note of the approach routes of both sides, the scope and range of Chinese missile arsenals and potentially devastating strikes on US and Japanese bases with slightly more success. Then we come to the US air refueling platform fleet. It is hopelessly outdated, with an average age of 52 years per aircraft, or as of 2021. This is while the US, alongside its Navy, explicitly relies doctrinally on its air superiority. Planned retirements will bring the number below the 479 mandated by Congress, as decommissioning currently continues to outpace incoming replacements. The situation of maritime refueling is also bleak. The Center for International Maritime Security wrote in January 2023, the Department of Defense is expected to need about 100 tankers of various sizes in the event of a serious conflict in the Pacific. The Department of Defense had access to fewer than 10 at the time. Not to mention the lack of production capacities for interceptor and precision strike missiles, which currently could not even satisfactorily handle a Russian scenario and are listed as instrumental in the CSIS scenarios. Furthermore, after both President Trump and the Biden administration took significant steps to bring Taiwanese key industries to the US, it is also politically questionable whether the military and economic repercussions and potential outcomes would guarantee support for Taiwan. This is why the US has long held the view of one country, 2 systems regarding China. Fifth, regarding high-tech, few analysts so far, but hopefully American and Taiwanese strategists and tacticians, are considering possible initiation of landings with hordes of robot-docked drones alongside air, surface, and underwater drones. China has long been producing drone carrier boats, and the capabilities of armed robot dogs, both on land and underwater, should now worry any soldier. In summary, the potential invasion of Taiwan is a complex and multifaceted issue. China's preparations, both militarily and in terms of the potential use of civilian equipment, suggest that an invasion may be more feasible than previously assumed. The decision to use civilian ships for military operations remains a sensitive matter, but has been significantly advanced, according to footage and various reports, through requirements for ferries to be able to transport military equipment from their construction and the increasing availability of vehicles that can function as landing bridges. As we continue to observe the situation, it is important to remember that warfare is not only based on raw military power, but also on strategy, innovation, and adaptability. We must be prepared for the unexpected, as history has taught us that surprises on the battlefield can very quickly reshape the course of events. The world watches anxiously as the dynamics in Taiwan Strait unfold, and of course, hopefully continues to hope for a peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. What do you think? Is a war inevitable? Share your opinion in the comments, as well as the video if it taught you something new or made you think. Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, take care. PS, a parting tip for the particularly loyal viewers, you might want to prioritize the purchase of high-tech acquisitions and spare parts soon. Thank you for your attention, this concludes my elaborations.